Предупреждение. Ниже приведены изображения действительно уродливых стариков с отвратительными, грубыми, старыми телами. Следуя своему усмотрению, зрители советуют.
Hello, Tovareshi. So, as part of my ongoing campaign to help people from different cultures understand each other, I've decided to start by helping two groups of people who actually have a lot more in common than they realize. Those being self-described conservatives and woke people. So we're going to take a stab at actually one of the biggest issues, which is gay stuff. So it's going to be very hard and, ultimately self-defeating to try to explain how conservatives think about sexuality.
Yes, according to the teachings of the Catholic Church, masturbation is considered a sin.
So rather than that, I'm just going to make an analogy, which is how smart people think. So let's start with something, something that is maybe not your form of sexuality, but, something that you can agree should be legal, at least as long as it's between consenting adults. Something that is like legal in all 50 states. By that I am referring to age gap relationships. Like I'm talking like 18-year-old girl, 80-year-old man, that kind of thing, Or vice versa, whatever floats your boat. If it's a granny and an 18-year-old, that also. But, predominantly it's going to be the other one. For various reasons, one of them being that men of all ages actually turn out to be most attracted to young women. Women tend to be attracted to people who are, within their own age group the most. But men tend to be attracted to young women no matter how old they are. So, there's that. But let's not get into the weeds here. Now, when I said 18-year-old young woman and 80-year-old man, you may have wanted to throw up in your mouth. And you know what? I think that's a perfectly natural response. Because I believe that being with someone who is within your own age group, or at least the same generation as you, is actually the most natural and normal way to be. But you know what? That's my opinion. That's my way of living. If people, if it's between consenting adults, even if I don't approve of it, if you want to have an age gap relationship, that's your business. That's how I look at it, okay? Even if it's not for me, which it isn't, by the way. So, let's put that into perspective now. Imagine that you live in a society in which, self-described sugar daddies, and remember, we're talking about between consenting adults here, in which self-described sugar daddies believe themselves to be, or sugar mamas, I'm not a sexist, but in which self-described sugar people believe themselves to be the victims of discrimination and prejudice and bigotry, and so just, having their way of living legalized isn't enough. Just being tolerated isn't enough. Imagine you're living in a society in which sugar daddies don't just want to be tolerated, they want to be accepted and even celebrated. Imagine you're living in a society in which some self-described sugar daddy who works at Disney is actually being interviewed and, is talking about how he expected more pushback when he went to work at Disney, but then he found that they were very supportive and, accepting when he kept trying to put his age gap agenda, his gap agenda into everything. Imagine that, artistic works, like movies and stuff, have become so predictable that, the instant you see, a young woman in the movie kiss a man old enough to be your grandfather, you instantly know that she's the good guy. And the grandfather is also a good guy. Or no, the grandfather age guy who's actually her love interest is also a good guy. Imagine if you were, watching movies and you realized that, people who have, a 60-year or, a 40-year age gap between them, are just always the good guys in movies. That people who have age gap relationships are always the good guys. And there's also a trend to remove problematic old guys from movies if they're villains. And so you see all these, think pieces in, Kotaku or whatever talking about how, I don't know, the Emperor Palpatine is a good example of, of prejudice and bigotry towards sugar daddies and things of that nature. And imagine, let's just imagine, for instance, that, you play a game, The Last of Us, and you really identify with the character Ellie, and you really like Ellie, And like maybe even think, I'm kind of like Ellie, that's me. That's my character. That's the version of me in that game. And then you play the sequel. And in the sequel, Ellie, who's 19 now, okay, so she's a grown-up, it's okay. It's, perfectly legal. But in the sequel, imagine that 19-year-old Ellie is in a relationship with a man who's older than Joel. How do you feel about that? A little gross. And if it feels pervasive, like almost like it's someone pushing an agenda, you might start to get really like annoyed by it, I'm saying. And then but you're like, you know what? Everything in The Last of Us Part 2 is disgusting. The whole point of the game was to disgust and horrify people. Okay, whatever. It's okay if it's not me, okay? I don't hate old people. I don't hate people who have age gap differences, whatever, in their relationships, as long as it's between consenting adults, obviously. I'll just move on. I'll play another game. So, you play Horizon Zero Dawn, and you really identify with Aloy. You're like, that's my character. I like Aloy. She's my favorite character. I want to be Aloy. And then you play the sequel. And in the sequel, she's we'll say, she's 21, she's definitely legal. She's old enough to drink in the United States, And then she gets into a relationship with like a 65-year-old elderly Chinese gentleman who teaches her kung fu. And you're like, okay, I don't hate elderly men, I don't hate people who teach kung fu to young people. And, between consenting adults, it's their business. But I kind of feel like I'm not being represented, because it's like all the time, all of these people who identify as part of the age gap community in the game industry, they just keep pushing this age gap agenda into everything, to the point where I'm starting to honestly feel like if you're into relationships with people who are within the same generation as yourself, you're not even represented anymore, except perhaps as among the villains, I mean, you will every now and then see some movie where there's some evil, intolerant people who, say like that God hates, sugar daddies or whatever, So every so often you do see like villains who think that people should be with people, of roughly the same age. But aside from that, you're starting to feel increasingly unrepresented. Now, let's carry this even further though. Let's imagine you're seeing something like, imagine you watch a video from someone who's like himself, like a self-described sugar daddy, who is concerned that some people in this community are going too far in a specific direction. Like, imagine, for example, that there's like Gap Pride parades in which young women wearing bikinis and older men wearing Speedos are just prancing around and, doing public display of affection, like PDA in front of kids and everything. And there's like people who, even members of the age gap community are starting to get nervous about this and being like, this is like way too sexual to be like doing in public. This is not right, We shouldn't have like young women in bikinis and older men wearing Speedos, like doing PDA and, walking around in assless chaps and that kind of thing in front of kids. This is not right. Imagine if at some of these events they even start teaching like kids to twerk, which is a real thing that actually happened, by the way. Imagine have you heard of the 11-year-old drag queen? That is unfortunately a real thing that actually happened. Imagine how you would feel if there was like an 11-year-old girl on stage doing, dances that maybe looked age inappropriate in front of an audience of self-described adult sugar daddies. Imagine how you would feel then, At that point you might start wanting to use words like, like groomer, for example, for those people. And imagine that if, when you call those people, I'm referring not to just anyone who has an age gap relationship here. I'm referring to the ones who are watching an 11-year-old performing for an audience of self-described grown-up sugar daddies. You refer to those people as groomers, and you're disgusted by them. And then people come up and be like, oh, you're a bigot. When you say groomer, it's just code word for, your generalized hatred of older men. You're just an ageist. You're disgusting. People like you should be illegal. You should be banned from Twitter for your irrational bigotry towards men old enough to be your grandfather. And just imagine that, imagine if it just goes even further than that, imagine there's like sugar daddy story hour, where, self-described sugar daddies want to read books to kids, and there's cameras and everything, so it's not like they're doing anything inappropriate. Well, except one time, there's a real thing that actually happened. There was a there was a drag queen who did a lap dance, performed a lap dance on a 15-year-old girl at a public high school. That was a real thing that actually happened. I wish I was lying about that, but I'm not. You can look it up. Imagine something like that happened, but in general, Sugar Daddy Story Hour was, nothing really age inappropriate. It was just basically an old man in a Speedo reading a normal book to a bunch of kids. Because the stated reason of this being that if these children grow up associating sugar daddies with nice people who read stories, this will prevent them from being bigots against sugar daddies later in life, okay? How would you feel about that? At that point you might be like, you know what? If it's between consenting adults, that's fine, but there's something very wrong about those so-called sugar daddies, wanting to promote the age gap lifestyle to children, If they find people who are already grown-ups and want to promote the age gap lifestyle to them, that's fine. But I know bigotry is wrong. I'm not advocating violence against old people. I'm not advocating violence against old people even if they have relationships with much younger people, as long as they are all adults, as long as the relationships only involve, consenting adults, people over the age of 18. And there's something just, I think you'd feel a little bit icky if there were sugar daddies who decided they're going to fight anti-age gap prejudice by reading books to little children. Because you would start thinking at that point, I feel like this is going beyond just, fighting bigotry. I feel like this is kind of an overt thing where they're just trying to promote their lifestyle to kids. It almost feels like grooming in a way. Uh-oh, you're a bigot now. You're totally going to get canceled because you used that word, which, as we've already established, is a code word for people who hate old people. So, just imagine that you live in that world, Imagine you live in a world where being woke is equated with not just being tolerant of age gap relationships, but actually celebrating age gap relationships and really pushing it. Imagine you're watching an army recruitment commercial, okay? Which is intended to be tolerant and woke and accepting. And this army recruitment commercial starts out with, our story begins in 2003 with a little girl who was born to a mother who is 19 years old and a father who served in the Korean War. How do you feel then? Seriously, how do you feel? How do you feel when you're being beaten over the head with the age gap agenda? That feeling you're feeling right now, that is how heterosexual conservatives feel when they're continuously beaten over the head with, what they perceive as gay stuff. When they're continuously beaten over the head with this idea that it's not just that being tolerant of gay people is a good thing, but that being gay is, probably the best way to be. And if you're not gay, you're boring and, just a stick in the mud and maybe a bigot. So I hope this analogy has helped you to understand how conservatives think. I'm not saying it's necessarily right. I'm not saying the way you think is necessarily wrong. But, maybe be a little bit more tolerant is all I'm saying. That's a good place to start. So anyhow, bye-bye for now. God bless.
انت ايش اسمك؟
شام.
وين احنا سكان وين انت؟
المغازي.
ليش خايفة؟
يا اختي مسكين لاي حدا تلاقيش هينا هنا.
ليش خايفة يا عمي يا حبيبي؟
أنا كنت بستنى لحد تخلص عشان ابني مسافرة وبستناها تيجي.
إن شاء الله بتخلص الحرب وبتشوفي أمك، تعيطيش.